We are live.
This is Literary Roadhouse. One short story once a week. I'm Gerald.
I'm Anise.
And I'm Maya.
And today's story is Sal Wants to Sleep by Serena Johe. I hope I pronounced that correctly. If you haven't read the story yet, pause the podcast and come back to it when you've read it. The story is about a young man called Sal who can't sleep. And there follows the story of his life from being a young child, trying to get out of his room to escape the long, boring nighttime hours when he was wide awake, through appointments with doctors and attempts to commit suicide. He ends up in a beach in Delaware, wondering how long it would take to drown. There you go.
Well, that was a nice, quick, and easy summary. How did everybody feel about this story on the top level?
I liked it. I'm sorry,
yeah,
but I liked it.
I'm actually very surprised that you liked it. I just knew you weren't going to like this story.
No. It's kind of. I've always been sort of not fascinated, but yeah, it's because we all at some time in our life have shortage of sleep, and some of the experiences of this guy, I think, yeah, I've had things like that happen. So it's sort of kind of, and it's kind of interesting to then push that to the extreme and see what would happen.
Yeah.
How about you, Anais?
I liked it a lot. I don't really have anything negative about it, so this might not be a very balanced show because we all seem pretty well. We'll see if Maya's 100% positive, but I really liked it, and it reminded me that I'm afraid of dying, so that's always good. So yeah, I loved it.
I liked the second half of the story. The first half of the story, there were multiple points where I just wish something would happen, anything at all. The second half of the story, I enjoyed it quite a bit. I think this is possibly the most Buddhist story we've ever read, which I thought was really interesting. It touches on a lot of themes, but the first half of the story, I struggled a little bit with it.
I'd say that the first part, I struggled a little bit with the first paragraph because her prose, she uses a lot of metaphor and analogy, and she extends it for a long time. And she actually does it skillfully, but you have to get used to the fact she's going to do this. Because a lot of times when a less deft author extends a metaphor for too long, you're like, okay, it got hokey or got cheesy. And it never got hokey or cheesy for her, but I had to tell my brain, hold thoughts longer for this story, because she really threads out analogies throughout the entire story, paragraphs and sentences. But once I got used to that sort of writing style, I really enjoyed her prose.
Yeah, I think my issue with it is I feel like the first half of the story, the tone of it very much matches the tone of the life that this young man is suffering through. And it's very hard to have somebody who is so just bored by being alive, having the prose being that boring. And I felt like the first half was there wasn't a lot happening. It did drag on. There was a point that I looked to see how far I'd scrolled, which are never good signs for a story. And at first I thought I was going to end up hating the story. I was about halfway through when I realized I was scrolling to see how much farther I had to go. And then gradually it was like it reached out and grabbed me and pulled me in. But that didn't happen until, the middle of the story, which is odd for me because the topic is something that was very interesting to me. It's a fascinating idea. We can talk about how realistic it is. But for me to find myself so bored in that first half was something that didn't really make a lot of sense. I'm like, why am I bored? Well, I'm bored because he's bored.
Well, that's kind of interesting because at no time was I bored. I loved the writing. I loved her analogies, metaphors. I loved her descriptions. I thought she did a great job of describing this young man and this child's life in an interesting way to me. I thought it could be it could have been such a tedious story because it's just about this one thing, but she really got into his character and she got into the practicalities and the experiences.
I think that's why I like the second half so much more, is I felt like the second half of the story really fleshed him out as a character and allowed his internal life to become much more real. I felt like the first half of the story was very tedious for me, and which is strange because you guys know I like funky language. I like lots of metaphors and everything. There were points when I had to stop and reread a paragraph because I'm just like, really? We're going to go here. Somebody's read too much Faulkner.
That's funny. I like Gerald. I never got bored like Gerald. But yeah, the first paragraph I had to read a few times where I was just like, wait, okay. And then finally, like, it's like, I feel like with a lot of authors, you have to like learn their style a little bit and then the story will flow. But one thing that Gerald said was, even though there was this one big dominant character trait, it didn't completely dominate the character. And what I mean by that is it would have been very easy to make the protagonist one-dimensional, but he wasn't.
No.
He was three-dimensional. He was compassionate, private, gregarious, funny. Like, he had all these other traits and concerns that I think it would have been very easy to slip into a one-dimensional character who's just depressed and agony all the time.
And I think that's, that right there, that second half of the story, I felt like by seeing how he's coping, I got to see so much more of his character. I got to see what he values the most, what he finds interesting enough to pull his focus. I found him very, very fascinating when he started to lose his touch on reality, because he has no ability to mark time. And we can talk a little bit more about symbolism, but the symbol of time in this story is a very strong symbol. And there's something about the way it's written that feels like a clock ticking a little bit. And I thought that was very, very well done. And it really, that second half of the story, I felt like it sped it up a little bit, just enough that I was able to dive into it easier. And I felt like the first half of the story was really slow. And part of it might have been because the first half of the story, he's so young. His personality is in flux. Hasn't really solidified who he is as a person. And so I'm not, like, he doesn't seem as strong as a character in the first half of the story as he does in the second half of the story, as he hits middle school and high school, and he's really developing coping mechanisms to not only deal with this issue, but also deal with the fact that how it's hurting other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think and I think that's deliberate. I think that as he gets older, she's written his character as a more interesting, and it's not just that he can't sleep and he needs to do something to keep him occupied, which was his very much younger life, but older, he's sort of developing coping mechanisms and tries goes out and drinks and is a sort of life and soul of the party with amongst people. He's now, which is what you said, he's now developing into almost a sort of fully fledged character with this sort of big elephant in the room thing that about his lack of sleep. So I thought that was very good. And also, I started noticing at one point that a lot of water analogies. Mm-hmm. And I wondered whether that was because of the ending. So there's so many times, and once I sort of started noticing them, it was all the time, sort of metaphor, water metaphor, drowning, and lots of
the shower at the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, for me, when I think of water, at least natural environments of water is constantly flowing the way life is flowing. Like, there's a reason why almost every religion on the planet has ocean gods and river gods and goddesses. There's a reason for this. And we are water. We need water in order to survive. And so it seems such a great symbol in this story for not only there to be a lot of water metaphors, but then for it to end at the water. This story at its core, I don't really see this story so much about a man who literally can't sleep, but I see this story more about passage of time in our humanity, and it's accelerated. It's brought more to the focus for him because he can't sleep. He doesn't get a break from the fact that life is dukkha. You know, he's constantly experiencing the suffering of being alive, which is where I said, where my idea that this is possibly the most Buddhist story I've ever read. Like, this sounds like something I'd hear at temple in a lot of ways. This constant passing of time, the ticking of his own head, the feeling of his body compressing because it can't relax when you're sleeping. All of that. And so the idea of water rushing and that time clock of constantly rushing, it's a droning, and it's beautifully done.
Yeah, I just one. It's quite interesting that the time element comes into it when he sees the doctor, who then says you're basically running out of time. So then the sort of pace starts to ramp up, and the time factor becomes a bit more prevalent. And I just wanted to mention on the time and the water thing, at one point she says days become a series of gapped stepping stones that can be taken in measured order, not the broad ocean and perpetual drizzle of which he could never stop being aware. So I thought that's a great way of bringing time and water into the same sentence.
Yeah, and she did that a lot, and also there was the a line where he could no longer feel the current that you're supposed to follow to lead your life, and I thought that actually made me think of Buddhism, because that's a bit of a Buddhist thought of, you know, feeling the current of your life and not resisting that too much. That's how you get a lot of frustrations, or I don't know. Someone told me that when they had read something Buddhist. And also there was the aspect of, even when he was very young, he's lying in bed, he's feeling his own body in the way that you're supposed to do when you're meditating, but he's not doing it consciously, right? It's just sort of happening. Like, he is very much aware that he's alive and everything's happening to him simultaneously at the same time because of his condition, which was so extreme.
Can we talk a little bit about this condition? Because medically, from what I understand, he could not have lived this long.
Yeah.
We medically need sleep to the point where, you know, a week, 2 weeks, tops, we're like going insane, showing schizophrenia symptoms, eventually just die. Our bodies just shut down.
Yeah.
And the unrealistic nature of the medical issue was very difficult for me to overcome in the story. I found it very distracting, especially that first half of the story, because the character wasn't strong enough to really make me overcome my disbelief. And this is what made me think Gerald wasn't going to like the story, because, you know, he's had his issues with magical realism. If this had been signposted as magical realism at the start, I could have gone with it. It could have kept me, I would have suspended my disbelief. But every time the story would get boring, I would pop into my head, this wouldn't really happen. He'd be dead by now. You know, and I found it very distracting, very, very distracting, the fact that we can't survive that long without sleep.
The strange thing is that on the Carve magazine website, it is signposted as magical realism, which is why I chose it, obviously.
I hadn't read that, but I
didn't read it either. I just dive into the story because I don't want any spoilers. But when I say signposted, though, it should be signposted within the story. Like, I don't believe that a story should have a disclaimer. Hey, if you want to enjoy the story, know this before you start reading. I actually have issues with that. I would prefer, there are special ways. If you look at the Masters of Magical Realism, usually within the first 2 paragraphs, it's signposted, oh, it's this kind of story. And then you can flow right into it. And I felt like that was lacking in this story.
I don't know. I sort of went with it. Yeah, it didn't bother me that it was unrealistic, because it was it was used so well to illustrate her point, and the theme, which was very depressing. You know, you keep saying that the first half felt boring because the character wasn't as strong, but also I think it's because more plot things, more setbacks happen in the second half. Like, the pace of it, True. In the beginning, the only big thing that happens is the one, like, doctor's visit where it's like, oh no, things are gonna be bad for you, little child. But then towards the end, you know, it has everything else, like the bleacher scene, the concussion, the attempted suicide, the trip to the beach. So it's like bang, 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 bang.
So let's go with this.
Yeah.
We know in the past we've read slice of life stories with like zero plot. Like, Gerald's ready to just off us both, okay? And I'm sitting here like, oh, it was great. If you don't have plot, you have to have something else.
Yeah.
So if the beginning of the story has like no real plot to speak of, you've got to have a really strong character. You've got to have something to hold my attention. If you don't have that, then I'm gonna fail. I'm not gonna be interested. It's not going to hold my attention. That second half, yes, it definitely speeds up a lot. He has a lot more resistance. He's dealing with a lot of emotional issues, which really drags me in. But the point is, if that first half isn't going to be plot heavy, then it needs to be heavy in something else that will hold me as a reader. And for me, that first half did not hold me as a reader. There were specific paragraphs that held me where it would pull me back, but I shouldn't have been lost that many times where I'm just like, what time is this? Is the whole story like this? Like, I can think off the top of my head 3 different times where I had to go back a paragraph because I was reading and forgot I was reading. And that's not good. Like, it's not a good sign, especially considering we've read a ton of stories with zero plot that I've enjoyed.
It's, yeah, I think it's strange because that first half was very character heavy. We were really inside the mind of the character and what he was going through, and I thought she did that really well. I was captivated by it, and I was wondering about this lack of realism and he'd be dead. I wonder, there were several points in the story where he seemed to lose track of time. Like there was a point in the bleacher when he was under the bleachers, and times a section of time disappeared. So I wonder whether he's actually is sleeping at odd times and just about getting enough sleep to sustain life, but internally in his head he thinks he isn't sleeping and he's panicking and becoming obsessed with not sleeping, when in actual fact he's sort of brain is shutting down.
I don't think he was sleeping. I think that moments where he was losing time, it's because he doesn't have the ability to stack hours on top of hours, and so all of life's experiences happening all at once in his head. So within Buddhist thought, there's this thought of enlightenment, and during enlightenment, there's different theories about what enlightenment is. And one of them is this flash of recognizing everything all at once. And I feel like that's kind of what's happening, where he ceases to be because he doesn't have sleep. Like what sleep does for most of us is we wake up, it's the start of a day, we go to sleep, it's the end of the day, our body rests, we repeat. And so we stack one day on top of another. And without that, all those days start to run together. And that's what I saw was happening. I think if he'd been sleeping, his parents or the doctors would have been less concerned. If he was maintaining just the minute basic amount of sleep, I don't think they would have been as concerned, and the sleeping pills would have had an effect. There's twice when he overdoses on sleeping pills and it does nothing for him. His body is physiologically unable to sleep. All he does is puke. So for me, I don't think he was sleeping, but those moments I found very fascinating to me. The first half, I mean, we're in his head, but there's not much. He's a kid. Like, I've talked to way more interesting kids than this kid. Yeah, he doesn't sleep. Yeah, he doesn't want to upset his parents. He's bored. What else is there,
Leave him alone.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, Gerald, that read of it. I don't buy it like Maya for a slightly different reason, which is I think they still would have been concerned that he definitely, like, even if you see this kid sleeping, he still definitely has some sort of extreme disorder that would make you concerned. But you would say, but buddy, you slept. Buddy, we saw you sleeping. Like, at some point, people would have said this to him, even if they were concerned because he's unwell. But that's still fascinating, the idea that maybe he was sleeping because he's so anxious he thinks he wasn't sleeping. I don't think this would happen, but that would be a cool story too.
Yeah. We're like, no, we don't buy it.
I don't buy it, but that would have been cool. That's also a cool story.
That would have been more realistic. It might have, if you're not going to signpost it as magical realism, that might have been more realistic.
And also about the child character, I think a lot of it comes to taste, because I was entertained enough with his whole like dinosaurs in the pipes thing. I was like, I found him interesting enough, and that just comes down to taste, I think. Because
I do. And that's what was so hard about this, because I could tell from how involved I felt in the second half of the story, that it wasn't a bad story. The writer definitely has writing chops. The first half just didn't hold me. But the second half, I found extremely interesting. And that's when the story finally caught me. And it grabbed a hold of me and it didn't let me go. And it was very philosophical. It was very meaningful. And I think that it redeemed the story for me, really.
Yeah. So, yeah. So the story was very depressing. It's one of those, like, I feel like I don't know if you guys, I recently saw
Where's a bridge? Is there a bridge nearby?
Yeah, I recently saw the Truman Show for the first time, and I just sat there stunned and depressed at the end because I thought it was a comedy, and it's not. So that was a surprise. And that's kind of how I felt at the end. I had a similar, like, just like stunned, kind of like, oh my God, existential dread feeling after this story. And it also made me think about unsavory things like assisted suicide or euthanasia, which is legal in some countries. Like, I was like, is he a good candidate for this? Because, like, when he attempted to commit suicide, yeah, I understand his mom shouldn't be the one that's there. She's gonna save him. That's her instinct. But, like, is there a place he can go to, like, maybe, like, I don't know. Do you guys think he was on the right track with that or not?
I'm not the person to ask because I am actually I actually think that the right to suicide is intrinsic in our life, in our right to life. If our right to life is no longer a right, it's an absolute imperative, and you're not allowed to not live, then it's no longer a right, it's a sentence. Mm-hmm. So I'm not the person to ask, but Gerald, on that depressing note.
What?
Well, I'm assuming you're not pro-suicide. Like, I know that I'm very rare in that thought process. I think if someone wants to kill themselves, I think they should have the right to do so.
Yes. Well, they do, because it's only in attempted suicide that they get arrested for attempted suicide.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to arrest a corpse.
Yeah, exactly. I'm totally. We have, because we have as a place in Switzerland that does assisted suicide for people who are terminally ill and make the decision, and there's all sorts of moral questions, but the people, they have these ideas and questions they ask to make sure that they know what they're doing, and I think that's great. If your life is really painful and difficult and you want to end it, then I think, in circumstances like that, in terminal illness, I think you should be able to.
Yeah, and see, that's the difference. I'm just across the board. I'm like, if you want to die, you should have the right to kill yourself, because we have the right to life. So it's the flip of that for me. For me, as I was reading this story, one of the things that came up is the fact that I recognize these emotions. I recognize these emotions from when I was a teenager. This waking up in the middle of the night and just this dread of what is life and how long it's going to last, And I think that that's a really fascinating thing, because what she's done is she's taken emotions that are really common in small doses, and she's amplified them and really examined them in a way that was extremely uncomfortable. But for me, like, that was the redeeming quality of this story, this emotion, this recognizing of the fact that we all are one, we're all going to die, life ends eventually, where do I end, where does the rest of the world begin type of feelings. Yeah, that was far more interesting to me. The right to life question, I mean, in my head, honestly, I don't think he would have lived more than 2 weeks without sleep anyway. But if someone comes and they've got an incurable disorder and they want to kill themselves, like, seriously, what's the problem? They're miserable. And people might say, well, it's selfish because the family's going to hurt. Well, how selfish is it to force somebody to live miserably just because you're going to be sad at a funeral?
Yeah. So I think what Gerald said, the whole, you need to also account for, people might be feeling a type of way temporarily and don't realize it. The whole like lucidity, a little bit of therapy, getting to the bottom of it, making sure it's a lucid, well thought out, sure, confident, genuine decision, and not just like. Because I think you do need to also sometimes not in this case. This case I think is pretty bad. Like, yeah, okay, all for it. But I think in a lot of other cases, like, there's people who are going through a depressive moment who don't actually really, in the total sum, want to die, but in that moment feel really bad, and that's when you need to be really careful.
Yeah, of course.
Agreed.
Yeah, it's well, I think. Yeah,
I actually disagree with that, but that's beside the point.
I think if you want to end your life, I think it has to be as far as you can be as far as you can make it. It needs to be a rational decision. It doesn't need to be the spur of the moment emotional decision. It needs if for whatever reason you want to end it, you need to. To me, you need to be able to make this decision and say, I want to end my life because of these things. And
I think that is the more common and the more acceptable view. And that's why this conversation makes me uncomfortable, because I know we're going to get hate mail, because I know that my view is extreme on this. Like, I don't necessarily have that feeling. I feel like forcing someone, I feel like someone else saying, I can decide whether you kill yourself removes life as a right for you. So life is no longer a right because it's up to somebody else whether you're going to live it. In my worldview, life is a right. And if you don't want that right, for whatever reason, whether you tell people or not, that is your right. Now, my reaction to it is going to be really upset and really sad, but I am not going to sit here and say, I know better when somebody else is sick enough, sad enough, upset enough, or has thought through enough whether or not they want to live. And I am very reluctant to give that oversight over to somebody else. I feel like the only person that can say whether or not someone should be living is the person that's living, because that's their life. And
what about a child?
That's a hard one. I was a suicidal child. I was a suicidal child. Wow. Like, I do not come to this thought process lightly. The fact that I chose to stay alive made it so that being alive was no longer as bad a torture because it was something that I chose. Now, my reason for staying alive is because I figured life was always going to be miserable, so I might as well figure out how the story ends. Like, literally, this is what kept me alive through elementary school. It wasn't, I want to live. It wasn't, my mom will be sad. It was, well, if I kill myself, I won't know how the story ends. But because I chose it, and because I knew that I could end it, it took away a lot of the pain that I was feeling as an elementary school student. Now, on the flip side of that, my kids had a kid in the neighborhood in middle school that hung themselves. Half the neighborhood saw the kid hanging on their way to school. It was really upsetting. I don't know how much pain this child was in, but I'm not going to sit here and say that he didn't have the right to do that just because he was a kid. Kids go through all kinds of pain. The amount of pain that children go through is something that most adults do not want to admit. But all the pain and depression and horror that adults can feel, kids can feel it just as much, if not more so, because they don't have the experience of life to buffer just how bad it is. And so, no, I don't have an exemption for that.
Yeah. We had a case over here recently where there was a very ill young child. I think it was a baby, sort of less than 2 or something, and the parents wanted to take him or her to America for some treatment. And
I remember this.
The health authorities said no, that would harm him more, and the journey would cause suffering, so we're not going to fund that. and not going to allow it to happen. And such a difficult moral decision, and I don't know what to think about that.
Yeah.
You know,
see, in my opinion, because you guys have socialized medicine, the government shouldn't have paid for it, but the parents should have had the right to pay for it on their own, because those parents raised the money. They raised the money, and the government was blocking their ability to leave. And that is my issue, because up until a certain age, your parents have the right to make decisions for you. And again, that's not the government's life. That's their life. They get to decide whether that baby tries to live or not. And it's the same thing to me.
But then it's difficult when the parents are causing harm to the children. So someone has to step in that case. So you can't say that parents have the ultimate right to decide what happens to their child.
Exactly.
So it's
a tricky ball for sure.
Yeah. And like, I understand what you're saying with everyone has a right to know whether or not they're going to live or die. It's just that my question is always becomes, but where do you fit in then helping people who have a mental disorder? Like, you know, how, like, where's that line? Like, how much do you help someone that once they're helped will lead a positive, good, happy life and be glad they didn't commit suicide? And how do you know when not to do that because this is a genuine person who's suffering and wants to die for rational reasons? And that's the tricky part that I don't have a degree in this. Hopefully somebody can answer that question a little bit better. But that's the question that comes up for me is I understand what you're saying and I don't disagree with it. It's just, but how do you catch the people who for them, this is just a temporary mental thing? Yeah. To help people who are sick, essentially.
Well, intrinsic in that question is the assumption that the majority of mental illnesses are temporary and can be fixed. The majority aren't actually.
No, but a lot of them.
One second. I got a car next to me. I'm turning off the mic for you.
We're going to turn it back on and make sure it's still recording.
I'll turn it back on. I just figure you don't want this on the recording. Because, you know, it's loud. It's a big truck. I think it's a Toyota Highlander. I am immortal. I have inside me blood of wings. Okay. So,
is the recorder back on?
Yeah, the recorder's back on. My thing is most people that want to kill themselves that have something that's just temporary are actually not mentally ill. So like people that are experiencing temporary depression because they lost a job or because somebody died, that's not diagnosable as major depression. There are a few mental illnesses that therapy and it's probably not going to come back. But the majority of mental illnesses are chronic illnesses. So whether or not somebody wants to live with a chronic illness, I'm not going to make that decision for them. So if they're depressed and they get therapy and they get better, that depression is going to keep coming back most likely. Schizophrenia, most definitely, unless it's caught during the very first schizophrenic break and they get the correct treatment that first time around, it's going to be a reoccurring illness. Personality disorders, I mean, that's something else entirely because those aren't actually chemical. Those are environmental for the most part, and it has to do with how you were raised. But the majority of mental illnesses are like asthma. It's a chronic illness that you learn to deal with. I deal with my asthma. But if I decided that the things that I love in life, I'm not able to do because of asthma, that's my life. I can do with it as I may. I kind of feel like that about mental illness. I feel like the issue here is that a lot of people with mental illness are fragile enough that other people can have power over them. And so you don't really know if it's them. So this is why they have the rules they have in Switzerland, because you don't want elderly people being talked into suicide by greedy kids. You don't want a girl with Down syndrome getting talked into suicide because the mom's sick and tired of taking care of her. You know, you want to make sure that it's coming from that person. But I don't think that making sure it's coming from that person should come from the direction of making sure that they're sane enough to make this decision and making sure it's well thought out, but rather making sure it's coming from them and not from somebody else.
Well, we can leave it there. And I was going to say, returning back to the story, since we're talking about
Yes.
lifetimes and when to end.
Yeah,
it.
hate
And
mail. Send it to mayagood@gmail.com.
So at the end, he's basically, it's a little ambiguous as to whether or not he's going to die. But one of the lines that I really loved, the final line I thought was genius, which was, how much time does it take to drown? Sal laughs, thinks, a lifetime. And I love that line so much because it kept flipping in its meaning for me. It was like permutating. So first, it's very personal to him. He always feels his lifetime all at once. So with his condition, of course, it's a lifetime. Everything's a lifetime for him. But also general to the rest of us, there's that idea that when you're dying, your life flashes before you and you experience all of it. So and there's like a distortion of time sort of slows down. So it made me think of that. And also in a very literal gallows sense humor, he laughs, which is like, when you die, that's your lifetime. Whenever you die, that's it. That is your lifetime. So I just liked how it kept permutating in my mind.
It was brilliant.
Yeah.
It was absolutely brilliant.
And normally I don't like ambiguous endings much. But this one I really liked. I thought it was beautifully done and well set out, and just so well crafted. Very, very good.
Yeah, I love the ending as well. It was brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you guys have anything else? Or
this was a depressing story.
Yeah.
Please tell me that what we're reading next week has something happy in it.
I think it's like a fairy tale. So, let's do ratings and then I'll talk.
It's probably going to be just as depressing.
I don't know.
Fairy tales, man.
Yeah. So, should we rate it and then I'll get into what we're reading next week?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll go first. 6.
Me too. 6.
No.
5.
Okay.
Wow.
And for people who are listening for the first time, it's from 1 to 6.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I give this a 5. The second half of the story redeemed it.
Okay.
Oh.
So, as some of you may have guessed based on our chatter before the rating, we're not doing a game this week because a longtime listener has been sending in a voice clip, which on the edited version, if you're watching this on YouTube, this is all going to get cut from the edited version. You can hear that clip. He has requested twice now that we read The Goose Girl by Johe.
And if you're a listener, listen to that voice and tell us how we could say no.
Yeah, I know. We're in love with that voice. So that's what we're going to be doing next week. And if you are like, what? This guy is so cool. I want to leave a voice message. You can do that on our website on the homepage. It's on the right-hand side.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're reading The Goose Girl, Joyce Carol Oates. But before you go, take a moment to think about the fact that on the internet, time is everywhere at once. Articles from a decade ago appear alongside images taken yesterday, and podcast episodes live forever at our archive at literaryroadhouse.com. Over 125 episodes and short stories to choose from. Overwhelmingly awesome. We look forward to the ceaseless blast of your thoughts and opinions on today's story on Twitter at Lit Roadhouse or in our Facebook group, The Literary Roadhouse Readers. You may also leave a voice message, like Steve, at our website. Do you need a longer distraction from the constant feeling that with each year you race faster and faster towards death? Read books with us on the Literary Roadhouse Book Club, because if time's going to fly by, we may as well make it fun and fulfilling. Also, after this story, we, like Sal's mother, need a trip to the beach to decompress. Support our... Oh, this got clipped. I'm going to do that again. To decompress. Support our therapeutic getaway and podcast expenses at patreon.com/Literary Roadhouse. Every bit helps. And as always, share this podcast with the emotionally drained father slowly checking out from your life. Until next time, read a good story.